Shalom Aleichem and welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. It is nice to be with you once again for this special episode. We are just a couple of days now before Tisha B'Av, and you suggested that perhaps we speak about Yehudah Halevi, and we titled this episode Yehudah Halevi, Kinnos, Kuzari, and the Cairo Geniza. So before we begin, I just want to thank, we had somebody who reached out and is sponsoring this episode. It is being sponsored by the Baum family, L'chavod Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut Shlita. So thank you very much. Anybody who would like to sponsor future episodes, please reach out to myself at Shwed M SCHWEDM @OU.org. Once again, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, reach out to myself or Eliezer Brut at EliezerBrut@gmail.com. So why don't we jump right in? Give us a bit of a background, what the connection of Rabbi Yehudah Halevi is to Tisha B'Av right now, and why you picked this topic to discuss.
Okay, fair question. So the reason is as follows. About 15 years ago, one Tisha B'Av, I decided to investigate a legend that I heard many times over the years, especially on Tisha B'Av, when right before the saying of the Kinnos, Tzion Haloi Tishali. And that legend, I'll quote it in the way Art Scroll Kinnos, because that's what a lot of people use, but we'll use other kinoses today, so it won't be just Art Scroll. It says as follows. An ancient manuscript states that Yehudah Halevi composed this kinno while journeying towards Eretz Yisrael and recited it when he reached Damascus, facing the direction of Tzion. Although many historians believe that Yehudah Halevi only got as far as Egypt, never even reaching Damascus, tradition has it that he finally reached Jerusalem, 1145. There he fell to the ground in a state of ecstasy. As he was embracing the dust near the Temple Mount, he was trampled and killed by an Arab horseman. This is how it's found in the Art Scroll, and there's all different. Now, this is a legend that I always heard, and I decided I want to trace the source for this legend and what we could find out about it. I was also fascinated by the Kuzari. Now, this topic seems to have drawn me into a rabbit hole which I never came out of. I published some of my findings in Hebrew and in English, but I always find more, and I need to keep in mind, Lo Yalecha Hamlacha Ligmar.
Okay, so yeah, you keep that in mind, even though we'll keep coming back to you for more information on more topics. So why don't you give the audience a brief biography of Rabbi Yehudah Halevi? As you said, certainly not in today's episode, but who was Rabbi Yehudah Halevi? When was he born? Where was he born? When did he die? And how did he die? But that certainly seems to be part of the legend. So a brief biography.
Okay, so just to make it very brief, he's born in approximately 1075 in Spain. He dies in 1141, which we'll be discussing more about that. He's famous in history for being one of the greatest paitanim. He authored hundreds of beautiful piyutim, pizmainim, that became part of davening in certain places, in certain tefillos, in Yom Neram and other times, more by Sfardim, but even by Ashkenazim. And he's more famous, amongst many, for authoring one of the most important Jewish philosophical works, that is, the Kuzari. It was written in a dialogue form between a king and a Jew who's persuaded to convert to Judaism. Of course, there's all types of questions, if the legend is true of that itself, if it happened, didn't it happen, beyond the scope of today. Anyway, this Yid defends Yiddishkeit, dealing with many issues of philosophy and various mitzvahs, among other topics. It's simply an incredible work. It has withstood the test of time, and it's worth reading and learning properly, very, very carefully, till today. It was written by Rabbi Yehudah Halevi in Arabic, but it was translated after he died in Hebrew. It was translated from Arabic into Hebrew in 1167, approximately by Reb Tibon, one of the famous translators of many philosophical svarim. And it had tremendous impact on machshava throughout the generations. Now, just to mention, the mashal, there's a quote found in the Sefer Taisis Meiser Rav that the Gra said about it, that you should learn it, because he was Kaddish Vitar, and Ikrei Emuna Yisrael Tluyimba. There's such a quote, powerful quote. Definitely Rav Avram ben Agra, his son, also was very familiar with the Kuzari, and many Gedalim throughout the generations from Rishonim and onwards were familiar with the Kuzari and used it. As far as his Pizmainim Lamashal, we have a source where Menachem de Lianzo writes in his Sefer Derech Chaim that the Minig Yisrael in certain places was on Leil Shabbos, they would sing different pizmonim of his. The Chida, when in a Shem Agdolim, when referring to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and discussing him, he says he was a Meshayr Atzim, Vayomer Shiroisav Noichach Pnei Hashem Bedveikus Gomer. Powerful Lashonis about him, and till today, there's endless literature about him, books about his Svarim, Perushim on his Svarim keep on coming out. Early manuscripts of works on the Kuzari has been published in recent years. Just to mention a recent edition of the Sefer Kuzari from Professor Michael Schwartz. It came out about 5 years ago. It's already in its 5th edition. Another edition came out to make it a little more user-friendly for the masses. But in short, the Kuzari has been, people have been fascinated with the Kuzari and probably will continue to do so forever. Okay, now that's just the introduction.
Fine. It seems like we need to have a separate episode or episodes just on the Kuzari. Mirz Hashem, there's time still ahead of us. Ezras Hashem. Okay, let's focus on what we want to talk about today. So you mentioned that in the Art Scroll, there's a story, a legend about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi about one of the Kinnos. So that Kinnos is the Kina of Tzion Aliyah Tishali. Maybe now's the time you want to get into what that Kina is and why we're having this conversation today, specifically about that Kina and the story of Yehuda Halevi.
Okay, so first, like this, as a way of a little introduction, the Kinnos is something we say every year on Tisha B'Av, and it's very hard to understand. Regular American Jews, we're not so familiar with the fancy Hebrew of the Kinnos, and it's always people have always found it very challenging to say it and understand what's going on. In understanding these rich piyutim, pizmonim, whatever you want, Kinnos, whatever you want to call them. In recent years, a lot of places have Rabbanim give different. They say they pick a few and then they give the background behind the few that they are going to talk about. Now, Rav Yosef Soloveitchik, it seems I don't know when he started this minig, but he had a minig that he would give shiurim from early morning till late in the afternoon, where he would discuss the Kinnos be'iyun gadol. Now, it seems some years they were recorded, and eventually they were put out by Rabbi Jacob. We'll just get it right because I don't want anyone to have complaints. Rabbi Jacob J. Schachter. This is the first book. It's called "The Lord is Righteous in All His Ways." Now, this is a transcript that he worked on very hard of the Shiurim. It's a beautiful read. Very, very. It could change one's Tisha B'Av. A little later, and this is printed by, I think it's Tav and maybe on some other places. A little later, Koren issued, based on those Shiurim and other nuschais of the various Shiurim, something, a Kinnos Mesiris Harav, and there's a lot of overlaps. They use Rav Schachter's materials, but they also had other materials. And when one goes through this, you get a tremendous insight into the Kinnos. And on this Kinnos, and this is by way of introduction now, at the end of the Kinnos, there's about 10 Kinnos that are called they're referred to as the Piyutim of Tzion. And
this is the Kinnos, I think, that you're referring to, right? That OU Press put out together with Koren, with Rabbi Weinreb.
Yes.
He went through it and he did an excellent job. And Rabbi Weinreb has been making these presentations on Tisha B'Av for years and years and years. Actually, very fascinating. In fact, this year, I got to thank you because he called me and asked me. Every year, he likes to speak about certain Gedolim that passed away. And this year, obviously, he has to talk about Reb Chaim Kanievsky. And he asked me if I could speak for a few minutes and draw upon some of the things that we discussed together. So thank you. And anyone who tunes in will see a short presentation about Reb Chaim. Again, like we said, we're not here to be master Reb Chaim, but the perspective of his Svarim. So
these Kinnos, it's a very worthwhile buy if someone to go through on Tisha B'Av, even not during Tisha B'Av now. Or Soloveitchik in the Kinna, it's called on the Kinna on Kinna number 36. So we begin saying about the Tzion Aliyah Tishali of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and some of the aspects we'll get back to throughout the presentation today. But he says like this: He says this kinna reflects the principle in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's important philosophical work, the Kuzari, that the land of Eretz Yisrael is unique not only in a metaphysical sense, but in a natural sense as well. The air is clear and charged with Ruach HaKodesh. Nature is more beautiful and magnificent in Zion than anywhere else. The rain, the soil, the stones are all physically different in the land of Eretz Yisrael. When the Torah describes the land of Yisrael as being a land of flowing with milk and honey, the intent is that there is a unique quality in the nature of the land itself. Then he goes on, and he says, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was in love with the land of Eretz Yisrael. While there are many pilgrims who traveled to Eretz Yisrael, none expressed their love for Israel as passionately as he did. For example, the Rambam, he mentions the land only once in Meir Nevuchim. The Rabbeinu Bechai, in his classic work Chavis Avavos, doesn't talk about Eretz Yisrael at all. Now, we know the Ramban was a medical lover of Tzion, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was perhaps the most Zionist, as Rabbi Soloveitchik says, of the Torah scholars of the Middle Ages. He says that Ramban described his love for Eretz Yisrael in halachic terms, which are familiar to us, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi expressed his passion somewhat differently. Basically, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lived in a comfortable existence in Muslim Spain where he was well connected with the government and was held in high regard. This is something we'll return to soon. Anyway, just to conclude, one last point about this kinna is Rav Soloveitchik says a fascinating insight. He said that these kinos, which are about 10, which is how we're Messiahing kinnos, is an important aspect of Tisha B'Av. There are two elements of the observance of Tisha B'Av. One is we say the kinnos, and it's to remember the destruction. But there's another aspect, which is to remember the magnificent prior to the destruction. Up to this point, when we said Eicha and Kinnos, it was focused on the first element, the destruction of Eretz Yisrael. But then it shifts, and we discussed about before the Churban. And that's what these Kinnos, they discuss in glorious terms the beauty and holiness of Jerusalem and the wisdom of her people. Now, this second element is necessary because in order to appreciate the magnitude of the Churban and what was lost, we have to be familiar with the beauty of the Beis HaMikdash and Jerusalem before the disaster occurred. Just to conclude, this is reflected in Halacha, says Rav Soloveitchik, with Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, when he talks about different aspects of, let's say by Lulav, we take it 7 days to Zeichel HaMikdash. This is to show us that there's different aspects, certain types of Zikaron HaMikdash, remembering of the temple around Simcha and not Avelus, and this was his goal to not Zeichel HaKorban, Zeichel HaMikdash. Okay, Al Kopanim, for this, for Rabbi Soloveitchik puts down, and he goes through the Kinnos, unbelievable, all types of Lashonis, pages and pages. It's kedai just even to read those few pages about it. And just to conclude with a Lashon, when he talks about it, he says, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, he wrote poetry beautifully. He was a Jew who loved Judaism. Basically, and so these kinnos are very important, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is the first, and then the next few are sort of copying Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's kinnos. Now the question is, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, why did he write this? Did he write it for Tisha B'Av? How did it get him into the Seder HaKinnos that we have? It's unclear exactly when this happened, but we could say with certainty that already Avram Frankel has an article, and other people have noticed that in Machzairim from, let's say, 1272 and the 1330s, even different Machzairim, and he lists out a bunch of them. In Ashkenazic circles, they took this piyut that we don't know when we're going to discuss when Yehuda Halevi might have said it, but it might not have been for Tisha B'Av even, and it got put into the Machzer, and so much so that the Marami Rutenberg is one of the next kinnos that we say on Tisha B'Av. He's copying Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's kinna. He's also from Ish Ashkenaz. Less than 100 years later, he dies. So we see that it got accepted pretty fast, and it's said as part of the kinnos.
Maybe before you go on, I'm sure this is a sugya on its own. Maybe a drop of a background, basic, when the kinnos were put together and where were they put together from? Can you give anything on that?
It would be too far out of the presentation today, but I do think on Svarim Chatter, Nachi had someone talk about it maybe last year or 2 years ago to give some type of basic background. But that's we're going to be going on too many tangents as it is. So to do that is way too many tangents. Whereas I call it tangents and tangents into tangents. Okay. Anyway, so Ad Kan, this is the first part. Basically, it becomes accepted. It's in the kinna, and we say it. Basically, everyone says it. I think even people that make a very short, that cut out a lot of the kinnas, they like to say this kinna, and we'll be discussing some more aspects with it as we go on.
So you mentioned there's a legend, and you want to tell us why are you suggesting it's only a legend? I mean, I guess I could ask the question pretty bluntly. It's pretty clear in Art Scroll that's what happened. I'm sure it's written in other places as well. So take us behind the scenes over here.
Okay, so as I said when I began the introduction, that I got curious as I saw this legends. I wanted to see, is it real or is it a legend? Or as some pessimistic people would say, oh, it's an Art Scroll legend, but of course it's baloney. Anyway, so Soloveitchik, returning back to the Shiurim, at one point he himself brings down this story, and he says, a story is told, and his lashon is, I do not know if it's true. And then at the end, he says, they say there's documentary evidence that he died in Egypt on his way to Eretz Yisrael. I do not know about it. Okay. But he in his shiurim brought down this legend. So I'll call upon him. I decided I want to look into this legend. Now, asking around, it's definitely one of the most famous legends associated with Yehudah Halevi. It's quoted in all different contexts, and I'm not going to mention all the different people that bring it down through the ages. Just to mention one that I came across in recent times it's such a fascinating legend, and we might even end up seeing that there's truth to the legend. Actually, is that in a advertisement for the Chumash that was about to be published in the 1770s from Moses Mendelssohn. So at the time, he had a partner, a very chashuv Yid, kosher Jew, according to Mahadjan, as Rav David Kamenetsky has illustrated in a beautiful series of articles in Yeshurun, was the Yid Reb Shlomo Dubnov. Reb Shlomo Dubnov eventually breaks off from Mendelssohn. That's not the parsha of today's discussion, but they put out some samples of how the Pirush is going to look to get subscribers, and in the back they had a few extra pages. So Shlomo Dubnov put in a Pirush on the Piyut, and he brings down this legend. So so you see that even though he's talking about Chumash, but he felt there's some type of attraction with this Piyut and with this story. Al Kopanim, I'm not here to discuss all the sources for it, but what is the earliest source that we do know in print? So the source for this is the famous Sefer, which is known as the Shalshelis HaKabbalah. Shalshelis HaKabbalah brings down the story, and it's first printed in approximately 1587. And he says that he has a Kabbalah from an old person that when he comes to Yerushalayim, he did Kriya, and then he was doing, as he said, he was bowing down and everything. And in short, while he said a kinna which was Tzion Haloi Tishali, but not that he then made up the kinna. It sounds like he already had this, and Eretz Yisrael was always on his mind, we know. And then a Yishmaeli, an Arab, comes, and because he saw his great Dveikos, he tramples him to death. This is, and now it becomes so accepted in the major from historical works of great Gedolim, such as the Karya Dairis, the Seder Dairis, and Rabbi Yosef Schwartz and Tuas Arz, and numerous other people. It's brought down as a given that this is the story. Okay. Now, in general, not to go into either, the Shalshelis HaKabbalah already, the Yehudah writes, and numerous sources say we don't trust a lot of the material found in the Sefer. It's full of mistakes. There's even, I think, a lashon. Let me see one second what the lashon is. So much so, what there's one lashon, early lashon, says ein mevi raya min ashaitim, but the Yehudah does not use such a strong lashon, but he uses a pretty strong lashon also against the Sefer. However, some people have said that even if you could say that there are problems with the Sefer, but you have to understand that a lot of times there still could be sources for some of the things that he said. So not that everything is wrong. Maybe a lot of things are wrong, but you still have to take in value. You have to evaluate each thing legufay shel davar. Okay, but so that's the first source, and as I said, it gets accepted through that. So, Amir Hashem, today we're going to discuss tracing a little bit through different ways if we could see anything about the story. Now, so as I said, right, and this is many times, people already said the story can't be true. One such person was a great, tremendous person, Matisyahu Strashon. Matisyahu Strashon, the great son of the Rashash. Already at the young age of 19, he's already married for a few years, and he's already incredible. And he's writing letters, and in the letter he has a 3-page passage where he deals with this story of the Shevet Yehuda, the Shashal Kabbalah, and it's an incredible just to read his Yeda and everything under the sun and how he's doing it. We're talking about, but we're not going to go into every aspect of it.
Where do you find these letters to read it?
So if one wants to read it, there's a collection of some of his writings. It was printed by Meiser of Cook called Mivchar Ksavim. So in the Mivchar Ksavim, printed by Meiser of Cook in the 1960s, in page Reish Tes, it starts on page Reish Tes Vav, it goes through Reish Yud Zayin. It's 3 solid pages, tiny letters, where he goes in depth with every aspect of the story. But the and even this, he goes in tangents. He goes what I call tangents and tangents. He's one of the kings of this. He actually writes about it in a place somewhere that's how he liked to write, even. And maybe I was influenced by it on some level, but he's writing like that. I talk like that. But anyway, and he had a tremendous impact on me. So it probably psychologically somehow got from there. But anyway, one lashon that he says is, we know that at that time there were no Arabs; it was mostly Christians. Okay, but anyway, he is not so into the story because in this piece also and other places he's not very big fan of the Shashal Kabbalah. A drop later, Shadal, who was very Isaac in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who put out various manuscript material of his Piyutim, also says the story. He writes more sharper. Again, similar reasons that there wasn't Arabs already in there. Anyway, there's a lot of discussion. I'm not going to bore you with all the details of all the different aspects of how in depth they take apart this poor piece of this Messiah that the Shashal Kabbalah brings down. But I'll say is as follows: when we want to check into a story, we like to find other evidence that might suggest similar sources or other people. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is a beyond famous person, so are there other earlier sources about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi that mention something about this when they talk about him? So we have, Baruch Hashem, we do have sources that mention Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, because as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is very early on in the Tkufa Rishonim. We have, let's say, the Ravid Seder Kabbalah. We have the Meiri Seder Kabbalah. We have a Chibur Rabbi Yitzchak Yisraeli Yisrael Olam, and a nice few other works, and they all talk about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. None of them mention this thing, which just sounds like it's something they would have. There are other sources that talk about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi after he died, from his Tkufa, people that knew him. They don't mention it. And just to mention one is there's a Meirdika Tshuva from the Rajba, and the Rajba talks about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. I don't remember how I came across it at the time, but he talks about him in Meirdika Lashinis, and he has a few lines about him, and he too does not mention anything about this story. I'm talking about people from Spain that would have heard about it, even though yes, the Rajba is a nice amount of time after him, but it's not mentioned anywhere. Okay. But that's not necessarily a way to disprove a story, just because we have a few people that don't mention it. Okay. So but we'll return to this. We'll return to a little more evidence if he actually gets Eretz Yisrael in a minute. Just to step back for 1 second, in this Messiah is what part of the story is, when is he writing this Kinna? So that already, it sounds like from different sources, he probably wrote it in Chutz La'aretz, and that doesn't make it, that's not a problem. Even when he could have said it when he comes to Eretz Yisrael, something that he made up earlier. Okay, now another way, in general, of checking out a story, we want to know is, or Salvation Marshall brought down, he's not even sure. He said he heard people say he might not even have made it to Eretz Yisrael. So is there any evidence that he makes it to Eretz Yisrael from other, forget about this story, this dramatic story, is there any other evidence? So the answer is that for such a thing, we have lists from where Gedolim are buried, and all over Eretz Yisrael. Everyone knows when you make a trip to Eretz Yisrael, one of the big things is you go. It's very important to go caver hopping, as they call it, and many people go with different tour guides, and people always wonder, how do they know who's buried in each caver? And actually, there's a story behind every one of these people. Now, a lot of times we have a Kabbalah, they say, from the Arizal, that the Arizal said this person's buried here. Okay, but we're talking about hundreds of years that there's no Messiah. Okay, anyway, there's lists, early lists, interesting lists of Rishonim that visited Eretz Yisrael, and they kept lists of, and they describe in certain places, oh, he's buried here, he's buried here. So we want to know, are there anyone early on mentioning Rabbi Yehuda Halevi being buried in Eretz Yisrael? That would help our situation a little bit. So there is an early travels from a Binyamin of Toledo, which it's printed 1170, which is pretty close to after the death of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And he does say that in Tveria, he hold on one second, let me just see the exact lashon. In some of the manuscripts of this chibur, it sounds like he was mevaker, the caver of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Okay. What's significant is we're talking about a Messiah less than 30 years, placing him in Eretz Yisrael. So at least we got some part of the story already is in Eretz Yisrael. But as I said, not all the manuscripts of this have it. And there are other early sources that some have him being buried. Okay, there's all different sources about it. I'm not going to list out all the different sources, just one important source. The Sefer Yochsin, who dies in 1515, he says that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is buried next to the Ben Ezra, and their relatives, and they were buried in Eretz Yisrael. That's a fascinating thing. And so the question is, did even the Ben Ezra get to Eretz Yisrael? But for that we'll get to maybe later on. But bottom line is, we have some messiahs, some sources that say Reb Yehuda Halevi is buried in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, and there's actually a Genizah fragment found from the 1400s that also says such a thing. And there's a long list. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but the point is we do have sources that point to him being buried in Israel. So at least some part of the story might be true. So, okay, that's I would say that's the first part of this presentation.
Okay, so now we're trying to figure out, deep diving, whether the actual story happened. In recent years, there's been a discovery of the Cairo Geniza. I've heard about it, I've read about it, but I'm sure Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut has probably spent, he may call it a rabbit hole. Is the Cairo Geniza a rabbit hole? Someplace he's probably spent many hours, days, months, who knows how long, studying the different information that's been discovered there. So this may shed light on the topic we're discussing today.
Yes. So interestingly enough, as I'm in this rabbit hole, I'm looking into this topic. I come to the topic of the Cairo Geniza, a well-known topic. So now, in short, when we talk about the Cairo Geniza, again, we're keeping in mind that we do want to finish today. We don't want to keep everyone here forever, but basically, in short, in the Cairo Geniza, there are documents that are discovered which are a game changer for our story. And now I want to give just a drop of a background as it relates to this. I personally just find it very interesting. Could be some listeners will also find it interesting. Basically, in the 1890s, there's a famous thing. Cairo Geniza is discovered in an attic in the Ben Ezra Shul. Okay, now, due to this incredible find, literally every area of Jewish literature and history has been greatly enriched. Just to list some of the many areas that were enhanced by this discovery, works of Gaonim that were lost were discovered, manuscripts relating to the Rambam were discovered, and much, much more. Piyutim and areas of Jewish history of Kufas that we didn't know much about also were improved because of these discoveries. Okay. Lamaisa, many people worked on it and are continuing to work on it as we speak. There's the Freeburg Project, there's all different things, Ein L'Davar Saif, to discuss all aspects. Now, someone wants to get a regular layman's understanding of what went on. There's a bunch of books. Here's one book I would say that I personally enjoyed a lot. It's called Sacred Trash from Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole, The Lost and Found World of the Cairo Geniza. A fascinating, light read, but makes it very, very interesting. Okay. Anyway, so there's this discovery, and this discovery rocks the world. You should just to understand that there's people today, even as far as people, Panavizhers, Hasidim, that have been printing works of Gaonim that they're discovering from the Cairo Geniza. Lost works of Reb Sadia Gaon have been coming out, and we're going to be hearing about more and more in the future still. In Kaivetz Beis Aron V'Yisrael, that's a Hasidic journal from the Hasidim of Stalin. They put out recently a bunch of pieces have been published from this Cairo Geniza by Yehuda Zeival, a Bayana Chassid. So it's not only in the academic world, it's everywhere. Anyway, like long story short, they went through the Geniza fragments, and crazy numbers of fragments have been discovered, and they processed it over a period of, let's say, 50, 60 years. And okay, a fellow named Shlomi Dov Gotin in the 1950s, he decided to ask, I guess at one point he was near where the fragments were. He said, do you have any pieces that maybe were not used or maybe not looked at? So he said, yeah, we have a bunch of pieces that which, according to all the people that looked it up till now, is garbage. We have place, so we didn't throw it out. You're more than welcome to look at it. This fellow Goten goes and he starts looking at it, and literally within minutes he finds material of the Rambam. He finds material of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that letters that was lost, that was missed up till now by people that had gone through sorting the materials, and slowly he does incredible works on the Genizah. And he realized that through this material that he found in the 1950s, so it was a rediscovery of the same Genizah fragments, what was deemed to be garbage, he chapped as beyond important. And he was able to to discuss a few hundred years worth of the world of every aspect of life in this period of time. And for example, he used to say at breakfast, his kids would hear from him. He would say the stories that he discovered. He would find a story from a piece of a fragment, and then he'd say, okay, but I don't know whatever happened. A few months later, he'd find another fragment, and he was able to put together different stories from all these different pieces of these materials that were deemed to be garbage. Anyway, I'm just cutting to the chase. One of the people that he found a lot of material related to in this Genizah, in this material, was of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. So much so, he always dreamed of putting out a book. He published articles of some of this material, but he never put out a book about it. However, Moshe Gil and Ezra Fleischer, two great professors who worked a lot in the Gainim and Genizah materials especially, put out one such book based on 50 such documents relating specifically to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi from this Genizah material. In the 2000, approximately 10 years ago, Mordechai Akiva Freeman revisited those 50 documents that they put out, and he published approximately 100 documents relating to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. On some level, it relates to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. We say not every letter is written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is an important figure in these letters also. So what happened is like this: they put out a fat volume, I would say 600-700 pages, and then came of and they so first is like this: the documents are in Arabic. They transcribe the documents into Hebrew, and then they analyze and have Torah to explain what's going on in these documents. And it's fascinating what we're going to see in these documents. Comes on Mordechai Akiva Freeman, and he goes through, discovers more documents, and he puts out, just to understand, 2 fat volumes of material, revisiting, reanalyzing with better kalim, figuring out, and the Dairish called Tag Shebet Tag, literally of everything going on in these things, and there's unbelievable parshas relating to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and more that one could learn from in these documents. Now, I'm obviously not going to bore today with all the finds and all the different things. Just to mention one thing that comes out is, why did Rabbi Yehuda Halevi even write the Kuzari? For us, the Kuzari is considered one of the most chashuv things that ever came out. Interestingly enough, he did not look at it as such a significant sefer. And one of the letters, hold on, let me see if I can find the lashon right now. Okay, I'm going to have to quote it. Anyway, it's a translation because I can't read no Arabic. But anyway, something to the effect that a friend of his found out about this chibur of his. He said to him, why don't you tell me about it? And he's like, it's nothing. What was he say he was mitiaches to this chibur that he wrote. Because we like, okay, whatever. And he says, I'll show it to you, no problem. You'll see that it's nothing special. It was in response to requests by someone who was because of some kfira and everything. And of course, this letter is analyzed to death, translation of every single word. One has to understand, this is written in Arabic. So what these professors have been arguing about is deals with, you have to have a major understanding in Arabic of the medieval period of time and what it means and every nuance. Okay, anyway, bottom line is, from these documents, we learn as follows. We learn about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi that he was a doctor. He was a tremendous chashuv Talmud Chacham. He was very close. He might have been a Talmud of the Rif. He was a close friend of none other than the Ri Migash. And everyone was fascinated by this person. He comes to visit Mitzrayim, and everyone wants to have him at the house. And they talk about him as a Meir Dikayir Shemayim. It seems everyone chapped. We're talking about a tremendous, tremendous Ovid Hashem. Now, he meets a friend. He becomes very friendly with this person, just for practical purposes. His name is, hold on, just to give the exact names, Chalfon. We'll call him Chalfon. But anyway, this Chalfon is where a lot of these letters that they discovered is between this Chalfon fellow, who's a businessman, who travels all over. Anyway, Akapanim, let's get cut to the chase. What do we learn from these documents that relates to our story? So what's amazing is that let's say a person like Rabbi Halevi, we know nothing about his regular life until they all these different historians, they try to analyze his piyutim and different things, but all of a sudden from these Cairo Geniza documents we learn about his last few years of his life, unbelievable in-depth things. And I'm just going to be makatzer in short, basically like this. It seems in 1129, when he was about 54 years old, he decided to make a journey to Eretz Yisrael. He began his journey. He was supposed to travel through Egypt. In the end, he didn't. He ends up somehow in North Africa. He becomes good friends with the Ibn Ezra. And we'll return to that, Amir Tishem. For some unknown reason, he ends up back in Spain. Why, we don't know. And he decides to make this journey again, which is 10 years later, which is in 1140. And these documents discuss a lot of the happenings of those few months before he made his journey, different aspects. Okay, Bekitzer, on September 8th, he had intended to leave from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael immediately. He was delayed. He ends up leaving a few days before Shavuos of 1141. So he ends up, I would say, he ends up staying close to a year in before he ends up going. It could be there was issues with traveling. We don't know exactly everything, but in these letters and these books, one's more than welcome to read it. Now, a letter written about 6 months afterwards indicates that Yehuda Halevi was no longer alive. It seems that he was alive for a few months in Eretz Yisrael, and he died in either Av or Tammuz. Now, these letters don't, sadly, these letters don't have what happens to Eretz Yisrael. Did he make it to Eretz Yisrael, or did he die right away? Okay, so why am I bringing it up? There's a letter that they discovered, and this letter actually was discovered earlier, but it was dismissed, that some of the scholars, I believe it was Moshe Gil and Ezra Fleischer, they seem to say that there's a lashon talking already about him of being dead, that he's dead, he was nefter already, and it says on a lashon zecher zayin koflam, zecher kadosh levracha is how they interpret it. And a few lines later in this fragment, it says Shara Yushalayim. So now, one has to understand, when we have these fragments, a lot of times they really are dotted out, not because they're fragments sometimes, and there could be very unclear words to read. So from the context of the sentences that they had, they suggested that it's possible we see something going on, Shara Yushalayim, in this fragment, and we see he's being referred to something unusual, Kaddish. Why would it be called a Kaddish? It's not so common unless something happened that he died al Kiddush Hashem. So they say that it's very possible, at least, that maybe this legend, so to speak, that the Shalshelis HaKabbalah brings down might be true. Now, they can't say for sure because this letter is fragmented. You could see pictures of it. I believe today you could probably see pictures of it online, but in the books, both of Moshe Gil and of Martha Akiva Freeman, Martha Akiva Freeman, when he reads this very carefully, he says it does not say that. He's not willing to accept that that's what's going on in the letter. You have to read the letter very carefully, the context. But it's referring to him as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi HaTzadik HaChassid Zecher Kaddish Levracha. So it could mean it's not that he was a Kaddish, that he died al Kiddush Hashem. He was a Kaddish, and that's Keseder we see has been referred to. So it's not necessarily that a Kaddish means that he died al Kiddush Hashem. But the point is that sometimes people are pessimistic about about legends, and here we see that there's a possibility from the discoveries of the Cairo Geniza, from this letter. Some of even the academics, who a lot of times are more skeptical, they're willing to suggest there's a possibility that there might be makam for this legend. But now we no longer could call it a legend. We have some possible proof. So first of all is that he gets to Eretz Yisrael. It sounds like from these letters that he got to Eretz Yisrael. So we now have evidence he got to Yisrael. Besides the Yuchsin and the different Makarios, if he's buried there or not, we now have some more concrete evidence that he's there. And there's a possibility in this fragmented piece. Some people are willing to accept that he does make it to Eretz Yisrael, and maybe that there is story behind. There is some truth to this story. Okay. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all the lashonis and all the yukim of the different professors how to do it, but that's one aspect relating to this. Okay, now, but let's step back a minute and ask a greater question. Why does Yehuda Halevi go to Eretz Yisrael? Lamaisa, it's almost unheard of during that period of time for anyone to go to Eretz Yisrael. No one goes. Even a little later, the Rambam goes and he leaves pretty much right away. The Ramban is a little later, and Ramban barely found the minion. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, it seems to be so central to his being as a person, so to speak. Why did he go? So some people say it has to do with he wanted to daven at the kvarim, which it sounds like even in this Kinnos like Tishali talks about. Okay, but it sounds very clear he was planning on living there. So it's not just the daven at kvarim, and you have to understand there was a major sacrifice on his part. He was a very successful person, a very famous person. Why was he going? Anyway, so different suggestions have been given. One suggestion was by Rabbi Yehuda Leib Gerst. He writes that since at this time Jews were very down, especially about Eretz Yisrael, he wanted to reawaken love for Eretz Yisrael, even though it was dangerous to go at the time. And he seemed that he says maybe many people probably tried to convince him not to go. He still gave up everything, family, friends, and a comfortable lifestyle to go. And so even if the story of the Shalshelis HaKabbalah is not true, but he was Mekadesh Shem Shamayim by actually going, because he was probably one of the first great people to actually go. Now, that's an interesting point. And just to add on this, it seems when one learns the Kuzari, so I would like to suggest even more. It's not just that he was trying to do this and give chizuk, which is very important because it's clear he was a big player in Klal Yisrael at the time. Everyone knew about him. And this is interesting because they didn't know about the Kuzari. We know about him as the Kuzari, but they knew about him because of through other ways. As I said, in all over Mitzrayim, when he's there, everyone knows about that this guy is this incredible Python, whatever. This is before YouTube, and he didn't have followers on Facebook or wherever else there is. Okay, anyway, so I want to take this a drop further, and that is based on, I'm fond of quoting from Reb Zevin. Reb Zevin has a sefer, Lar Halacha. In the sefer, he has a piece where he turns the Kuzari and he deals with him as a ish halacha. We know, everyone knows the Kuzari is a sefer, a philosophical sefer, so to speak. But there's a lot of halacha in the sefer. If one reads it very carefully, you can find all different things. And the Reb Zevin shows how certain pieces of his became are negei halacha. And I'm going to talk more about this momentarily. But as far as Eretz Yisrael goes, so Rav Yehuda Halevi, not only was he a person that was an Oyev Eretz Yisrael, and it shows in his Sefer Kuzari and in his Piyutim, he held that one has to go to Eretz Yisrael. If one looks very carefully at the pieces, it's in the end, Maimer Chamishi, I think it's Ois Chav Gimel Chav Daled, he uses Lashonis that even though it's a sakana, one has to go to Eretz Yisrael. Now, what's interesting is, in Rishayim already, and Achrayim, one of the terim for people not to go was because it was always considered a sakana. And he says, no, if people, for jobs, people do put themselves in sakana, and other things. And he talks about this at length. And basically, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, it's not that he only was a Oyev Eretz Yisrael and he went, it's because he held the halacha one has to go. And he was putting his, as they say, the expression, put your money where your mouth is, he was acting upon it. He held one has to go. And that's why he went. He was giving up everything at the time. He was giving up a comfortable life. And as I said, he was a very famous, very successful person. And he went and there was nothing going on there. It's not like today you make Aliyah and you have different places. Okay, I live in Ramat Beit Shemesh, so you have to throw out Ramat Beit Shemesh. No, he was giving up everything. There was nothing there, but he was such an Oyev Eretz Yisrael, and he held that halacha one has to go. So I'm building off this Reb Zevin that Reb Zevin that the Kuzari was also ish halacha, so halacha he held to go. Now, and it's so much so that this piece, interestingly enough, I recently came to this piece of the Kuzari, the Chavas Yarn is an incredible sefer from Kar Chaim, and Ar Chaim he brings it down. It's not clear what exactly he wants from it, but it seems like he's and using it about dealing with if it's a sakana in travel, etc. But the point is that it's Rabbi Yehuda Halevi with Eretz Yisrael. So this, if we go back to, it comes out Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was an Ish Eretz Yisrael. But he went to Eretz Yisrael. He made Aliyah, so to speak, and because Stami held the Chashivas of Eretz Yisrael, which he deals with, and also because he held Allah one Shagar Eretz Yisrael. Now, I want to just at this point just to discuss one nukuda, just to elaborate very briefly, which I'm saying Reb Zevin says, showing him as in the light of ish halacha. So I came across a very interesting thing in the sugya of date lines. So first of all, the Kuzari is quoted by many different people, even the Ramah quotes him in Shuvas, and the sugya of the date lines, which is an incredibly complex sugya and rocked the world different times, especially when the Mir Yeshiva was in Shanghai. It was a very famous topic, and different Rabbanim got involved, but it was already discussed, different aspects were discussed earlier. So one of the famous people involved with the Shaila was the Chazon Ish. And throughout the country, he wrote a kuntris called Kuntris Yud Cheshois. And throughout the kuntris, I believe he quotes the Kuzari something like 20 times. Now, and it's clear, it sounds like he's using the Kuzari as a halachic source. Interestingly enough, some of the people that discuss the sugi of the date lines, they hold not to bring a raya from the Kuzari because he's not a ish halacha. Now, happens to be when you learn through the Sefer Kuzari, you could see that he was holding in the sugyas. He knew what's going on. Doesn't need my askama, so to speak, but he was, as they say, ganz fine. But we now know through the Cairo Geniza he's very close to the Rimigash, etc., etc. Now, the Chazon Ish, what I like to point out is as follows: the Chazon Ish had to hold that he's a ish halacha lishi tasai. What in the world am I talking about? So there's an incredible conversation which needs a lot of arichos, which is that the Chazon Ish held that there's no such thing as someone being a bal agada. That he knows the agada. You mean say someone could be a mashkiach. He doesn't know how to learn well, but he gives good shmuzin and inspirational shmuzin. The Chazon Ish was very scared of such people. He held those people are dangerous. You have to be a ish halacha, and in order to, and only could a ish halacha be an ish agada, but you can't be just ish agada. And it's a very big conversation. It relates to a lot of different things. It relates to Chazon Ish's tainus on Musar, possibly on Chasidus. There's these pieces of the Chazon Ish that were edited out of the Emunah B'Tachin, and not everyone accepts the Chazon Ish, but this is the Chazon Ish's opinion. So the Chazon Ish l'shitasa, if he's using the Kuzari in the Diyun of date lines, it's because he held no, there's no such thing as if someone wrote a classical work in philosophy and he's a chashuv yid, he's Oved Hashem. No, he must be that he is a ish halacha. And now, so going with that, the Kuzari out to ish halacha, he held. Now, could be it's a not everyone agrees with it in the sugyas of mitzvah yishuv Eretz Yisrael and making Aliyah, but he held one has to go, even if it's sakana, and this is what he talks about in the Kuzari talks about in his sefer. So this is a ha'ara of mine. You can take it or leave it. I have no problem with someone argues on it. Okay. So Adkan, this is the story, this is the legend, and as we're saying that there's something behind the legend. Okay. So we're basically saying that it's just because it's art scroll, it's not a problem, and there might be truth to the story.
There might be truth, even though you didn't bring rayas to every single point of it, right? Every last detail,
right?
But
right.
The overall concept. Okay.
Right.
So just off on a tangent to drop. We talk about Rishonim. I'm sure this is a sugya on its own. Every person who lived in the generation of the Rishonim was a Rishon who we rely on la halacha. I'm sure that's also a topic of discussion.
Correct. It's actually a very big discussion, and people, I believe, I heard such a thing that some people were upset. I think, let's say, ArtScroll put out this incredible book called the Rishonim, and they have a book on the Achronim, very excellent books. And people were upset because they listed tons of people. And he said some of these people, they shouldn't be called, just because you live in a certain period of time doesn't mean you're a Ritva, Rajba, Ramban. And it happens to be there is a lot behind that story. And it relates to this Chazon Ish, as I said, and it's its own conversation. Are there people that were Bali Mikra, so to speak? They were experts in Chumash, but they didn't know any halacha. And is it possible to rely on them in Chumash, so to speak? But you're 100% right. It's a huge topic. Maybe one day someone will talk about it properly.
Okay. That's somebody. We have to find that somebody. Okay. Any other legends with the Yehuda Halevi before you finish out?
Yeah. So I just to conclude the last few minutes of today's presentation is as follows. As it relates, because it relates a little bit, and we'll be able to get back to with the Cairo Geniza drop as follows. If you look, there's again going back to Soloveitchik, where he has these shiurim that he gave on the Kinnos. So he mentions something to the effect like this. Let me see if I can find it. Legend has it that Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra was the son-in-law of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. He says like this: when I was a little boy, I was told that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was writing a poem, appeared, and did not have time to finish it. So he left it on his table. In the meantime, he left the house, and Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra came home, looked at it, took a pencil out of his pocket, added something to it. When Yehuda Halevi came back and saw the edition, he became determined to find out who had written it. He finally concluded that Avram ibn Ezra was the only person in the world who could have done it, so Avram ibn Ezra married Yehuda Halevi. Okay. Salvation brings down that in one place in his commentary in Chumash, the Ibn Ezra says, Yehuda Halevi, may he rest in peace, asked me, so he obviously knew him very well. This is what Salvation says. So the question is there any truth to this legend? And what's the source for this legend? So we're not going to go into a deep dive, as you called it, correctly, into this legend. Just mention, once again, who's the earliest source? The Shalshalas HaKabbalah. Okay, so we got to get worried. Of course, and like everything else, there's different versions of this story and different aspects of the story, and they say similar story with Rashi, and okay. Like everything else, Baruch Hashem, there's a sefer written about the piyut. The way the story goes, it was a specific piyut. The piyut Mika Meicha Adoin Chasadecha, that Sfardim have a minute to say on Parsha Shabbat Zachar. Of course, in the past few years, a book came out all about this piyut and deals with this legend. It's called Mika Meicha, from a fellow, let me see if I can find his name, Rabbi Yisrael Baramoish Elio, a nice small country, and he deals with this legend. He basically discusses if it could be true, not true. Anyway, fine. But bottom line is, they were very close. This is clear, and he's quoted a bunch of times in his writings. In Ibn Ezra's writings, something I think someone quotes maybe even 20. This is discussed by Naftali ben Menachem, who was very Isaac in Ibn Ezra. Okay. Now, why is this Nageya? Does the Ibn Ezra make it Eretz Yisrael? So I had mentioned earlier one of the sources when we were discussing the different lists of who's buried where. The Yuchsin brings down that they're related, and they're Kvurim biyachad, and there are other sources that say such a thing. So it sounds like he made it Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yehuda Ibn Ezra. Interestingly enough, recently there was an article written by Professor Uriel Simon, one of the world experts in the Ibn Ezra, and it was incorporated in one of his recent books on the Ibn Ezra called Diyukan Shel Parshan. He has a whole chapter is why didn't the Ibn Ezra go with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi? And he has a whole discussion based on these Cairo Geniza documents and incredible Yedias in the Ibn Ezra's story. And dealing with, and he says it's better that if he would have gone, we might not have been zeichet to have what we got from the Ibn Ezra, and he documents this in his article. But it could be that at the end of the day, he, as I said, is the Yuchsin and there's other sources that he is buried in Eretz Yisrael. So even though he might not have been his son-in-law, but he definitely knew him. They seem to have a close relationship, and this is actually documented. Now, just to mention two last nakudas about this, and we'll finish. We'll conclude. So we already mentioned that in the Genizah, from the Genizah fragments and other materials, we know they met also. So it's besides for that they met and they had a close relationship, as it's known. Ibn Ezra quotes him, as Salvation says, one time, but it's much more. Okay, now, interestingly enough, again, in the early sources of Rishonim that we have, like the Ravid, Seder Kabbalah, the Miri Seder Kabbalah, when they talk about them, they don't mention that there's any relationship between them. Starting later on, maybe the Abarbanel might be the earliest source, or Bazari Menadayimim, others, they do start mentioning it, that there is a connection between them. Okay, now the Shashalas HaKabbalah, his story gets accepted by certain Makairis, such as maybe the Seder Dairis and others. L'maisa, L'mashal, the Chavas Yar, when he talks about the story, he says, "Cause of who?" Okay, fine. Even though the Ibn Ezra brings down the Yehuda Halevi a lot, but he says he doesn't ever refer to him as that he's my father-in-law. Fine. So he says it doesn't sound like that. Maybe after, if you want to say the story is true, even though he says it's because of him, he said maybe later on he got married to Yehuda Halevi's daughter. Okay. Now, like everything else, where is it a possibility that there could be some connection between Rabbi Yehuda Halevi through marriage and Ibn Ezra? So that's what we'll conclude. There's an interesting character, and that is the son of the Ibn Ezra. This son, his name is Yitzchak. Now, this Yitzchak was an interesting person. Seems to be he was also a great Python, and it's clear from the documents that he was close also with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And it seems that there's a good makom to suggest that this person was a son-in-law by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. So there really was a family connection, but it's not 100%. It's still ongoing, as they say. They're handling all the details and working out in the analysis of the different documents relating to this. Now, this person was a Python. Sadly, there is a source that says supposedly at one point this Rabbi Yitzchak went off the derech. also questionable. Why, what, we don't know necessarily, but we do have some of his, miraculously, they did discover some of his piyutim, and we don't really know if he really did go or didn't he go off, but there is makam to say that he was actually a son-in-law of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. So there is some type of truth, but not the truth of that, yes, as the way Rev Soloveitchik was saying over, which is sort of from the Shalshal Kabbalah. So it basically is like this. There are legends with Rabbi Levi. There are other legends. This legend got different legends took upon. They sometimes switch the name. It might not be Rabbi Levi. So it's Rashi, others, because these are the heroes of our ours throughout the generations. So that's why legends are attached to them. But sometimes one should not make fun of legends, because sometimes at least some aspects of the legends are true, and maybe all aspects are true. And just like there was the Cairo Geniza discovery, it could be there'll be more discoveries even in the Cairo Geniza. Maybe, who knows? That will shed further light on the story of this great Python. And so this is giving you some insight, but as I said, make sure to learn through, let's say, Rav Soloveitchik or others when you're saying these piyutim and thinking about Eretz Yisrael. Ad kam for today. We'll have Rachmanis.
Thank you so very, very much, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. I would like to once again thank the Baum family who sponsored this episode. Please reach out to us. There is much more that we would like to do. And Baruch Hashem, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut is here and ready to prepare much more content to be shared on various platforms. So reach out to us, comments, questions, suggestions, and may this episode maybe inspire somebody to think a little bit more about the Churban, think about Eretz Yisrael, and we should be zeicha to be together in Eretz Yisrael. Thank you very much.